Welcome. This is your introduction to FAA's new method of assessing and reporting runway conditions, presented by the NBAA Access Committee.
I'll be the host for your briefing. My name is Pete Combs.
We begin with an overview of the 5 modules contained in this presentation, along with a brief history of FAA's Takeoff and Landing Performance Assessment Initiative. This briefing is broken into 5 separate modules. First, we'll define the runway contaminants found in field condition reports. The second module will show you how the airport operator assesses runway conditions using FAA's new Runway Condition Assessment Matrix. We'll also look at how the airport operator reports these conditions to the user community through the FAA's NOTAM system. Our third module explores these field condition NOTAMs in greater detail and introduces the new runway condition codes. In our fourth module, we'll review some of the certification standards that apply to takeoff and landing performance in airplanes widely flown by business operators. We'll also introduce you to FAA's new guidance for developing takeoff and landing performance data for use on a contaminated runway. Our final module will look at how pilots use these new tools to assess takeoff and landing performance and reduce the likelihood of a runway excursion when operating on a contaminated runway. We'll also look at the key role pilots play in the runway condition assessment process by providing accurate braking action reports. Runway excursions are an ongoing problem in aviation. A runway excursion happens when an aircraft veers off from or overruns the runway surface. These events can occur during takeoff or landing and could involve factors ranging from unstable approaches to runway surface conditions. Runway excursions are on the National Transportation Safety Board's top 10 list and the subject of an FAA call to action. These events are on the rise with the potential for loss of life, not only for those on the aircraft, but for those on and around the airport itself. While runway excursions involving an airliner often make the news, these events are also a concern for business aviation. In fact, worldwide runway excursions are more prevalent in business aviation than they are among commercial carriers. Our segment of the industry faces unique threats because of the nature of our type of flying. It often involves operations on short runways and on runways without skid-resistant surfaces, such as runway grooving or a porous friction course surface. These surfaces help to improve water drainage and braking when it's raining or when the runway is damp. A lot of airports we fly to have approach limitations that might require tailwind landings in less than ideal conditions. By far, the most significant factor in runway excursions is the condition of the runway. Wetness or contamination are factors in almost half of all runway excursions in both commercial and business aviation. Other factors include long landing flares, fast approach and touchdown speeds, and strong crosswinds. Following several high-profile runway excursion accidents involving the airlines, the FAA sought help from the industry through the Takeoff and Landing Performance Assessment Aviation Rulemaking Committee. The FAA asked the TALPA ARC to provide them with recommendations on runway condition reporting and runway excursion prevention, along with recommendations for improved performance data for takeoff and landing on contaminated runways. The TALPA ARC provided FAA with a host of recommendations, most of which will be introduced during this briefing. One of the TALPA ARC's most important achievements is the new uniform method for assessing runway conditions based on observed contaminants, as defined in the Runway Condition Assessment Matrix. There are 2 versions of this matrix. The version for airport operators is shown here. Pilots have their own version as well. Airport operators use their version of the matrix when assessing the observed runway contaminants and their depths. That information is organized based on the known effect of a particular runway contaminant on an airplane's takeoff or landing performance. The observed contaminants are reported to the FAA through the Notice to Airmen system, which then generates a field condition NOTAM for the runway that's passed along to users of the airport.
Based on the reported contaminants, the FAA's Notice to Airmen system also generates runway condition codes for each runway third. These codes can directly correlate to the landing performance data furnished to pilots, which allows them to determine the landing distance required for the reported runway condition code. These codes have replaced the runway friction readings, or mu values, so familiar to pilots in the past. Mu values have been deleted because the TALPA committee was unable to find any direct correlation between these friction values and an airplane's stopping performance. The FAA expanded on pilot braking action reports, providing improved descriptions of airplane deceleration and airplane controllability for different braking action terms. These descriptions also correlate to the new runway condition codes and will help pilots determine the amount of deceleration and controllability after landing when braking action reports are not available. These new descriptions will also help pilots make accurate braking action reports. They allow a comparison between the braking action reported during landing against the runway condition code, which could alert both pilots and the airport operator to deteriorating conditions since the last runway inspection.
The TALPA committee made recommendations to the FAA on improving takeoff and landing performance data that directly correlates to the type and depth of contamination identified in the runway condition assessment matrix. Further, they worked to tie landing performance data directly to the runway condition codes. You'll find the results of the TALPA committee's efforts in 2 new advisory circulars that help guide airplane manufacturers on developing contaminated runway takeoff and landing data specifically designed to work with the new runway condition codes and contaminant descriptions.
Until manufacturers can furnish landing data based on this new guidance, and for older airplanes whose manufacturers are no longer in business, the FAA is providing a set of landing distance factors based on the reported runway condition codes and braking action levels. Factors are furnished for turbojet, turboprop, and reciprocating engine airplanes. These factors are applied to the dry runway unfactored landing distance found in the AFM to determine the landing distance required under the reported surface conditions or braking action. This distance includes the FAA's recommended 15% safety margin.
The FAA has updated several publications to help communicate these new changes to the aviation community. In Advisory Circular 91-79, Mitigating the Risk of a Runway Overrun Upon Landing, pilots will find detailed information on landing performance, runway assessment, and the use of the Pilot's Runway Condition Assessment Matrix. For airport operators, the FAA has updated AC 150-5300-30, Airport Field Condition Assessments and Winter Operation Safety, which provide updated guidance on using the Runway Condition Assessment Matrix when assessing field conditions. The FAA also updated AC 150-5200-28, Notice to Airmen, for airport operators to assist them in reporting these assessments through the NOTAM system and then on to airport users. The FAA has dedicated a website to TALPA that provides pilots, airport operators, and manufacturers with a single source for information and guidance on this effort. The link for this website is included on NBAA's dedicated TALPA webpage. One of the primary goals of the TALPA effort is to provide pilots with the tools and data they need to accomplish a time-of-arrival landing distance performance assessment. Using the runway condition codes and braking action reports, along with the landing data designated to work with these new items, pilots are now able to make a well-reasoned assessment of the airplane's stopping performance during landing. From there, they can make an informed decision. Is it safe to continue with the landing, or safer to land on a different runway, or even at a different airport?
Now that we've introduced TALPA, here are some key things you need to know. The assessment guidelines and field condition NOTAM changes became effective October 2016. These guidelines and reporting methods will standardize the field condition reports received by pilots. Runway condition codes are replacing mu values, since these codes better describe the stopping performance and directional control capabilities for the reported surface conditions. Pilot braking action terms now correlate to the runway condition codes. This change helps pilots and airport operators compare the expected deceleration for the runway's reported condition against the deceleration pilots actually experienced during the stop. The FAA is providing manufacturers with new guidance on developing performance data that can be used with the reported contaminants during takeoff planning and with the runway condition codes during a time-of-arrival landing performance assessment. The FAA encourages operators and pilots to adopt a practice of completing a time-of-arrival landing performance assessment. Pilots should use the runway condition codes and braking action reports to determine if the runway is suitable for landing. They should also determine how bad the runway can deteriorate before it's no longer suitable for a safe landing. Finally, the work of FAA's TALPA initiative has caught the attention of others outside of the United States. ICAO and other agencies are following the TALPA effort closely and are considering standardizing on the work that FAA has already accomplished.
On the NBAA website, you'll find links to the 5 briefings that will further introduce the TALPA effort. We encourage you to take time and view these briefings. You'll also see links to the FAA's TALPA website and material we hope will help you incorporate TALPA in your operation.
Before we close, we'd like to gratefully acknowledge the following organizations for their tremendous help in developing this briefing: the Federal Aviation Administration, and especially the Flight Standards Air Transportation Division and the Flight Technologies Division, the Society of Aircraft Performance and Operations Engineers, the Transport Airplane Performance Planning Working Group, Aircraft Performance Group, and NBAA's Access Committee.